Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Swampfox Justice RDS. If someone makes a red dot sight, chances are I'm going to get it and I'm going to evaluate it, especially if it's marketed for personal protection, concealed carry, duty carry, what have you. Justice is no exception. I had an experience with the previous generation, they still make it, of the Swampfox optics, the Kingslayer. However, I didn't really do I didn't do a video on that because I did not feel, based on the features and specifications and the way the optic was discussed by the manufacturer, that it was intended for duty use or really concealed carry. It had some features that just didn't kind of allude to that, and the manufacturer themselves said that that wasn't its intended purpose. So when they released the Liberty and Justice series, they did tailor it and advertise it for duty carry, and I was like, game on. Yes, there are two different models, however, at a first glance, they're pretty much identical as far as features go. However, the big difference, the only difference as far as I can tell, is window size. I went with the larger window in the Justice model for my evaluation period. It does share an RMR-esque, non-industry standard footprint. So I mounted on a Gen 5 Glock 17 that has been aftermarket bettered by Agency Arms to do the review. Now, there is a departure. If you've been watching my RDS videos for a while, you know, for video purposes, I do a 2,000 rounds, and that's just pretty much my standard for all reviews. However, my evaluation process for an RDS is every 500 rounds, a number of tests take place. For video purposes, what I would usually do is zero the gun and then immediately do a 500 round burn down. As of filming this in early 2021, I have departed from immediately doing the 500 round burn down. Don't worry, I'm still going to do it if the optic gets that far. However, I felt just for the sake of video purposes, and then hopefully if an optic broke on the first drop test, the only time I would have with it would be zeroing and the burn down. So I wanted to change things a little bit. So now I do 500 rounds of just personal practice and evaluation of the optic before I get to the burn down. So the burn down takes place second. We will get to that. Features and initial impressions. Mounting was pretty much straightforward because it shares the footprint of the RMR, so it's pretty much non-standard. Standard is to screw down traditional RMR footprint. It is a top-load battery powered by a 1632, which is kind of the way everybody's going with batteries. The adjustments are manual. I like that. It's got a shake-awake feature, which means if the gun sits idle for a certain amount of time, dot turns off. Any vibration whatsoever turns it right back on. You'll frustrate yourself trying to catch the dot not being on by grabbing the gun really quick or anything like that. So it's not something you necessarily have to concern you with. And if you're riding a vehicle, the vibration of the vehicle is probably going to turn the dot on and keep the dot on. It is 7075 aluminum and is quoted for a battery life of approximately a year. Shake-awake is definitely going to help extend that. Now, glass clarity is a thing, and it's definitely something I'm interested in optics. The glass clarity on the Swampfox Justice is actually really good. I'm not super surprised about that because it's not hard to make a clear lens. But usually, the cleaner and the clearer a lens, more true color you see through it, the less battery life you end up getting because the dot has to project brighter because there's no notch filter. So the more bluish tint a lens has, or the more notch filter a lens has, generally the longer the battery life, but also you notice that. Didn't get a lot of distortion out of the glass. That's one thing I appreciate on any optic. It's not something that significantly concerns me, but it is something that I would rather not have if given the option. And what I mean by distortion is if you look through your optic on a horizontal line, say the top of a fence, baseboard, wainscoting, whatever you got, the edge of a table, something long. If the line comes in and then drops down or goes high, and then out the other side of the optic it goes back to the same plane that the other side of the optic is on, that's some distortion you don't necessarily want because it adds to aberrations in sight picture that you may or may not actually ever notice, but it's something I'm curious about. And lens quality, to me, is determined by how little or how much distortion is there on those horizontal lines. And there's a big mathematical discussion, or I should say description, of why that is good and why it is bad. One thing I thought was cool about Swampfox is they actually quoted their parallax at 33 yards, which means inside and outside of that distance you are technically shooting not parallax free. Although you probably won't notice that on any pistol optic, but most pistol optics are set focus parallax for a certain distance. It's generally not published information for some reason, but Swampfox went ahead and put it out there. Getting into it for the first 500 rounds, dot clarity is really good, dot refresh rate is really good. What I mean by refresh rate, and that may not be the right terminology to use, flicker. Some dots, based on what kind of LED emitter they use, the quality of the LED emitter they use, or some kind of electrical issues or some combination thereof, when you transfer from target to target, quickly that dot stutters or flickers. And you could notice this if you get a cheap laser pointer, like a little $3, $4 laser pointer, and you do like this on the wall, you'll notice it segments. It's not a solid laser line. Whereas if you buy a high quality laser, or you project the laser out of, like, say, a D-ball or a mall or something like that, you'll notice the beam is uninterrupted when you do that quickie thing. That's kind of what I'm talking about, is refresh rate. Same concept, same principle. With some red dot sights, if I'm transitioning from target to target very, very quickly, I get a stutter in my red dot, which I do not like. This optic did not have that problem shooting, you know, changing point of aim, changing depth, changing distance. One thing I did notice, and this is certainly not unique to the Swampfox optic, is in certain lighting conditions, usually with a backlit target such as the sun, I get halo effects around the LED emitter projected onto the window. It's not super bad, but it's not great either, and it's something that you definitely need to be concerned about, because you don't really get to necessarily choose the time and place in which you have to use this thing for self-defense purposes. So it's always good to practice and be familiar with that haloing effect. But for the first 500 rounds, I didn't experience any really negative issues whatsoever with the Justice. The first drop, the shoulder height drop. People sometimes ask, if you're new to the channel, you're just seeing one of my videos for the very first time, why are you doing a shoulder height drop test? I'd never dropped my gun like that. I appreciate your ability to predict the future. However, it's not because I feel like people are going to be doing that. I dropped the gun to simulate in a pretty much consistent manner, from a consistent testing method, hard shock to the optic. I've already had reports from some of my students, my RDS classes, because if you didn't know, YouTube's not my main thing. I actually teach classes for a living and do YouTube kind of as a hobby. I've had students who've come through my classes later on come back to me and say, hey, I broke my X optic, not even out of the holster, just rolling around on the ground with a guy trying to get handcuffs on him, or, you know, whatever the situation is. I've got a pretty good report going of what optics can handle, you know, body weight being rolled across them. So if an optic can be broken inside a holster designed to protect that optic, that's on the optic. And maybe a little bit on the holster, but I'm going to blame the optic a little bit more. So I want to make sure the optics can handle that, and drop test is just one consistent way I can do that. Now, after that first drop, I did have a little bit of chipping in the top left corner of the optic window. Not a big deal. I did check zero. Zero was maintained after that first drop, but I'd already had the lens start to chip and fracture. That gave me pause, something I was worried about, but I continued the test. The next thing I did was, well, your 500 round burn down. What I'm looking for in a burn down is if that accelerated rate of fire causes any issues I wouldn't notice with the same round count over a much longer period of time. In that 500 rounds, I'm happy to report I didn't have any flickering, any fading, or any issues with the dot that I noticed whatsoever. So burn down successful, which brought us to our second drop test. Second drop test, that chipping in the top left corner of the lens didn't get any worse. So I continued on with the testing, working what I normally check on. One of the things I do with optics during testing is single hand manipulations. Something we teach in defensive handgun shooting for whatever purpose, like using a handgun for defensive purposes. Occupation is irrelevant. If I have to shoot the gun one-handed, and then my luck's even worse and I have to manipulate the gun, say, you know, I'm slide lock and I got to reload or I got to fix a malfunction or something, I can use the optic body to work the gun off of an object, which is something I include in my testing because it's something people are going to do. Because the Swampfox lens sits so close to the outer edge of the shroud right there behind my rear sight, which most people are going to have their rear sight to the rear of the optic, I was concerned that I was going to be making lens contact with objects that I've been manipulating the slide off of, which is one of the reasons I put my optics or my rear sight forward. But that's something I was paying attention to during the single-handed manipulations. Happy to report that didn't cause any scratching, any issues, any dislodging or tweaking of the lens. Everything remained in place like it should. Made it to 1,500 rounds and the final, or say the third drop test. And again, the lens cracking up on the left-hand corner didn't get any worse, and it was still maintaining zero after 3 shoulder height drop tests at 1,500 rounds. Still continued working with it, and I didn't have any experience or notice any other issues during that process of shooting it. And one of the things I have had happen with other optics in the past is once they get a little bit of a crack or a chip in the lens, round count starts to make it larger. It's like getting chip in a windshield. The longer you drive the car, the larger that crack or that chip is likely to get. Didn't have that happen with this particular optic, which brought us to our final drop test. Unfortunately, on the fourth drop test, that crack came all the way down the lens, which is a little visually distracting. But I do like the way the lens breaks. And you may be asking, like, what? Depending on lens composition, materials, however they put it together, what they make it out of, sometimes when a lens cracks, it becomes very opaque. You can't see through it. Some optics, when the lens breaks, you can still see through it, which is how this one broke. But the lens hasn't completely fractured and left the body of the optic. It's just had a crack that runs from top to bottom, and like that left 1/3 of the available optic window. And it, well, did it maintain zero? That's, of course, another question. If an optic takes a significant hit, you should definitely check the zero on it. Let me show you the 5-round group I fired for zeroing purposes on 124 grain gold dot at 25 yards. So here is a 5-round group fired after the final drop test. That is zero maintained. So even with the significant damage to the lens itself, the emitter, for all intents and purposes, the zero, for all intents and purposes, was maintained, which is exactly what we want to see, even if the lens, even if the shroud, even if the body cannot handle that significant impact of a shoulder height drop test on a hard surface such as paving stone or concrete. Now the question is it duty quality? Is it duty ready? Which is a very, it's a term that's open to interpretation. I have my definition. So when you watch this video, I'm not trying to set a standard. This is just how I evaluate optics. I will say this is a significant improvement over their previous generation of optics, which is exactly what companies should be doing. Everyone should be striving to make the best product, but I do understand that some people are more interested in making the money than they are in producing an optic that's going to last, because they know the average shooter, as they see it, is not going to experience or put their optics through the same kind of stuff that I put my optics through during evaluations. But I set a standard, and every optic either meets it or fails it, and that's pretty straightforward. This particular optic, it's an asterisk. Yes, it did make it through 4 drop tests of 2,000 rounds, but the 2,000 rounds is just for the video purposes. I'm going to continue to test this optic, and I feel like maybe on the next 2-3 drop tests, that lens is coming out. And that's okay, because that's part of the process. And hopefully manufacturers pay attention to myself and other people who test these things, and also get real-time feedback from people who use these optics in the field, and they use that to make their optics better. Because I want everybody to make good optics, and then we just have preference, which would be awesome. And then we can just argue about brands instead of, you know, failure rates, quality, and stuff like that, because everybody's making good stuff. But I feel like that's more likely going to be a fantasy land, because there's always going to be a company making crap. This optic's not crap. I would not, and this is just me based on my testing methodology and my personal philosophy, this is not an optic I would carry in a duty capacity, in a uniform, open carry duty holster. I would not use this for patrol or SWAT or any kind of purposes like that, where the optic is much more likely to encounter contact with foreign objects. The dot quality is good. It works well in low light, works well under night vision, works well in various sunlighting conditions and various lighting conditions. The adjustment methods are great, but the durability is just not quite there. For concealed carry, for plain clothes duty, or for whatever, this optic's a solid choice. And then it just comes down to, do I want something with this footprint at this price point? Because ultimately that's what we're looking at, right? Long term, I don't know. I don't know how this optic is going to be in 3 or 4 or 5,000 rounds, because at this point I only have 2,000 rounds fired on it. But during that 2,000 rounds, give me an opportunity to get acquainted with the optic. And I am impressed with the, like I already said, impressed with the improvement from previous generations. And I feel like they're getting very, very close. And I do understand, and maybe you don't, that a lot of these optic bodies are kind of limited in what they can do design-wise because of existing patents on other optics. Yeah, so they may not be able to do the most robust, most durable, best designed shroud and body because of someone else already patented that idea or patented that design, and that's just something that happens, and that's, you know, a good and a bad thing. It's not easy to make a durable electronic device in this size. It's not easy to make durable electronic devices, period, and usually you end up paying for it. So it is nice to see something that can handle a little bit of abuse come in at a pretty reasonable price point. But, and I will say this again, it's not something I would recommend, and I know even though Swampfox kind of marketed it this way, I would not recommend this for duty use. I just wouldn't. Concealed carry, plainclothes duty, and when I say duty use, like I said, I mean an exposed duty carry holster, patrol, SWAT, something like that. No. Wouldn't use it as an offset 45 on a rifle. No, because a 45 offset on a rifle is much more likely to take inadvertent contact with the environment than a holstered handgun is. So, for concealed carry, personal defense, hobby gun, excellent. I think that if they keep going the way they're going, their next generation optics are going to be even better, and probably wouldn't have any problem whatsoever getting my stamp of approval. But I am not the standard by which all optics are judged. I just have a standard by which I judge all optics. And this one passed, but it is with an asterisk, at least for the 2,000 round review process. I will give you guys an update in the future. It may not be a video, it might just be a post on Instagram or something like that, or grab the latest edition of the Sage Dynamics white paper, which will be out soon, to see how far the Swampfox Justice made it in my testing procedure. But if you're curious about my feelings on this optic, here you go. I'm Eric Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.